Okay, thanks everyone. My name is Eli Asarian with Riverbend Sciences, and I'm going to talk to you about some research I've been doing, or some analyses I've been doing on long-term trends in streamflow on the North Coast. So I wanted to start by mentioning that almost everything that I'm going to be talking with you about today is contained in these three reports, starting in the lower left with the analysis that I did for National Marine Fisheries Service as part of their coho recovery plan. Declining stream flows on the North Coast had been identified as a factor contributing to the decline of salmon and steelhead. And so they asked me to see what data was out there to look at and address that question. So I did that analysis back in 2013 and 2014, and then I finally got that published early this year. And then in the intervening period, I did a reanalysis of the data just for the Eel River, using a little bit more detailed methods and extending a few more additional years. So the first analysis covers a pretty large area from the Mattole up to the Rogue River in Oregon. That's what I'm going to be focusing on here today. I'm going to focus on the California portion and the coastal part of the California portion. So here's a map of the long-term streamflow stations from the U.S. Geological Survey on the north coast of California there. I've highlighted the range of the redwoods in green. So you can see that my study area extends quite a bit further inland than the redwood region. But I'm going to focus on those coastal results. Some of these rivers, like the South Fork Eel in the lower left corner there's multiple gauging stations on the same stream. And so when we have multiple stations, what we can do is we can subtract the flow of the upstream gauge from the downstream gauge and get kind of the net difference between those and use that as a kind of an additional site for analysis. So for each one of these sites, for each year, I calculated a bunch of summary statistics, such as the average flow for each month and many others, although I'm just going to focus on some monthly averages here today. And I'm looking at the period 1953 to 2012 because that's around when most of the gauges went in the 50s and early 60s. So we were interested not just in what are the absolute trends in stream flow, but what are the factors that are contributing to those trends. And precipitation is the ultimate source of stream flow, and it's also the source of the greatest amount of variation from season to season and from year to year. And so I developed a technique to account for that using what's called the antecedent precipitation index. And so in the plot there you can see on the upper panel is precipitation, so there are days when it rained, and the bottom panel shows flow and the precipitation index. And so you can see on days when it rained, the precipitation, there is precipitation, and then the flow and antecedent precipitation index go up. And then if there's no rain, then the precipitation index kind of decays down. It's basically a time-weighted summary to kind of distill a whole year's worth of precipitation data into one number that's a lot easier to work with statistically. So it's obviously not a perfect predictor for stream flow, but it's a good kind of proxy that's pretty highly correlated. So here's an example of a plot for one site for 1 month. This is Bull Creek for the month of September. This is down in Humboldt-Redwood State Park, near where some of us went on a field trip yesterday. So on the x-axis is the precipitation index, and the y-axis is the observed stream flow. So each of those dots represents one September from 1960 up to 2012. And so you can see in the years when there's more precipitation, there's more flow. And so we can use that relationship. And one thing to notice here is there's some color coding where the yellow and orange sites, the yellow and orange dots are the more recent years, and the darker blue dots are the older years. And so basically, the equivalent amount of precipitation now in recent years results in a lower stream flow than it did in the earlier decades. So we can take that kind of that difference between the observed and the center regression line and plot that out as a time series, and I call that precipitation adjusted flow. So here's that same gauge for Bull Creek for the month of September, a time series from 1960 to 2012. And that precipitation adjusted stream flow is declining at about 2% per year. I'm not showing the plot here, but if you look at just the unadjusted stream flow, just the absolute stream flow, it's going down at an even greater rate of about 2.7% per year. So if we compare those two slopes, we could say that factors other than precipitation are contributing to about 2/3 of the decline in stream flow in Bull Creek. So that was an example just to sort of walk you through how the methodology and the calculations work. If you want the details, read the reports or ask me questions. So now we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to look at a subset of the results for the rain-dominated system, so staying out of the higher elevation, snow-dominated sites and looking just at the coastal areas, and also the ones that are not significantly regulated by dams. And so on the left panel there shows stream flow, and it shows the percent of sites that have a significant trend, either increasing or decreasing, for each month of the year. And so what you can see is that there is actually no site in any month that has an increasing stream flow. It's either declining or flat. And the greatest percent of sites with the decline is happening in September. On the right panel, showing the precipitation adjusted stream flow for the same months, and we can see that there's additional months where there are sites that have a declining stream flow. And I think the reason that there's more months is that precipitation is so variable from year to year that once you account for that variation, it kind of just smooths out the data a little bit and makes it easier to see the trends. So you'll notice here that there's kind of a peak in decline around September. So I'm going to show you a map here of the September results. So it's kind of a complicated graph, but I'll try to, oh no, my symbols disappeared. Okay, in my legend. Okay, so the direction and the color of the arrows shows if it's an increase or a decrease. So a downward-facing red triangle are decreasing stream flows, and an upward-facing blue triangle is stream flow increases. So basically, the only stream flow increases that were, oh, and I should say, the bigger the triangle, the bigger the increase or decrease, and the darker it is, the more statistically significant. So unfortunately, I don't think that I have a pointer here, so, or do I? No. Is there one?
Go off the screen, right?
Oh, okay, great. Oh, okay. So along the main Trinity River, we're seeing stream flow increases, and similarly on the upper Eel, those are really the only sites with big increases. And that's basically because there's, those are highly regulated by dams, and in recent years there's been mandates to increase the amount of water that is released for fisheries. And so, one way to increase stream flow is if it was previously heavily diverted and you stop diverting so much water, then your stream flow will go up. So that's what's happening there. It's a little bit more complicated understanding why the declines in the other sites. So let me walk you through some of the coastal sites. No changes in the Smith River up here. Big declines in Redwood Creek up near Orick at both gauges, as well as the difference between the two. No decline at Little River. Pretty large declines throughout much of the Eel River basin, except for near the headwaters of the South Fork here, and also in the Middle Fork. So I'm going to talk you through some of the reasons why we might be seeing these patterns. So here's a map of just some patterns in precipitation. Unfortunately, my symbols are a little bit scrambled here. But basically what's showing is that there are some minor increases in precipitation in the spring period for April through July. There's really not a lot of precipitation happening in those months anyway, so if you have a little bit increasing by a little bit more, it doesn't mean that much. That's similar in August, even though it's declining a little bit, there's just not much there. But in September, we did see pretty widespread stream flow declines across a good portion of the area. Interestingly, when I redid this analysis later and added a few additional years, right after I finished my initial study, it started raining in September again every year, and it's rained every year in September since then. So this is actually not a significant trend anymore. Maybe it was just a climate cycle that we moved out of. So that's a good thing that our September rain is back, but it was gone for maybe a decade or two, pretty much. So I'm going to talk about some of the factors that could be contributing to these stream flow declines. And I should mention here that I'm kind of stepping out of the parts of the analysis that I've quantified. I'm kind of moving more into informed speculation here. So many of you have seen these maps from California Department of Fish and Wildlife where they used air photos to map marijuana gardens and estimated the amount of water that is being used to grow marijuana in these watersheds. So what I did is they have about 5 watersheds where they have done these estimates. And so I took, and unfortunately they don't really overlap with exactly the boundaries of the long-term stream flow gauges. And so what I did is instead I'm going to compare kind of the range that they saw out there on the landscape and compare that with the range of stream flow declines that I found in my study. So here's a place where the water use for marijuana is relatively low. That's the Mad River. And we normalize that to the watershed area. It comes out to about 1 cubic meter of water per day per square kilometer of watershed. And it's basically, it's a very large watershed, and the gardens are kind of scattered fairly widely through it. On the other extreme is Redwood Creek down sort of near Garberville, and there the number is up around 10 cubic meters per day per square kilometer. And that's just because there's just more denser concentration of gardens. It's still not throughout the entire watershed, but it's throughout much of it. So remember that range about 1 to 10. And now I'm going to compare that with the observed stream flow declines. And so here's the 1 to 10 range from the Cal Fish and Wildlife estimates. And then on the y-axis here is the total decline in stream flow over the study period. And here I'm showing results from my Eel River study, which includes an additional 2 years, basically because I had this slide already pre-computed from another presentation. But what you can see is that the declines in stream flow at these sites is actually much larger than can be accounted for by the Cal Fish and Wildlife water estimates use for the marijuana water use. So if we kind of compare the two bookends, the range of about 1 to 10 versus 30 to 100, the marijuana might be accounting for something roughly in the order of 1 to 30% at these large basin-wide scales. And so what that means is that there's other stuff that's going on in these watersheds that's driving the stream flow decline in addition to this increasing water diversions for marijuana. And so I don't want to minimize the effects of the marijuana diversions, especially at the smaller streams. If it's a small stream and everyone turns their pump on at one time, it's pretty easy to just dry that stream completely out. It only takes drying that stream up for 1 minute any time during the year to basically kill everything in it. But when you zoom out and you look at these basin-wide scales, there's other contributing factors. So one thing that's probably going on and contributing to that is the encroachment of conifers. So here's an example of Douglas fir moving up into oak woodland and prairies, which is happening at a pretty widespread phenomenon across the landscape here. Here's kind of what the early stages of it look like, and then eventually the fir trees will grow up, they'll shade out the oak trees, and you see these skeletons in the understory. It's basically like a conversion from prairies and oak woodlands into the Doug fir forest. And I don't think that we really understand or have quantified the effects of this on the watershed hydrology. One thing that seems intuitive to me is that if you're replacing a deciduous species with an evergreen species, that the amount of interception of the winter rainfall is going to be increased. But I don't think anyone has really quantified that effect yet. That would be a good thing for someone to work on. Another thing is that over that 60-year period, there's been a lot of changes due to recovery of the landscape from timber harvest in a lot of these areas. So here's an example of Bull Creek, a photo from 1968 and a photo from 2014. And so the 68 photo, this was after a decade or two of pretty intensive tractor clear-cut logging and 2 major floods. The entire landscape has basically kind of melted and flowed in and degraded the stream channels, and there's a lot of areas of bare, actively eroding earth across the landscape. And that was right around the time the gauge went in. And so as the vegetation has grown back in that period since then, it appears that it's resulting in lower stream flows. even though, in general, the habitat conditions and the sediment loads are going down and habitat is improving, the summer flow is actually going down. Yeah, also in Bull Creek, there is some of the, there were some natural prairies, or there still is some natural prairies on the ridge tops mostly, and those are being encroached by the fir trees, in addition to the timber-related stuff. Not sure what point to make about that car alarm. I'll just mention real briefly here. This is way inland of the coast, but the Salmon River, which is the tributary to the Klamath, it was the only site where we had increasing flows for July, September, and August, and it's also the site that has the greatest % area burned. Some modeling work from elsewhere in the Northwest shows that this was a watershed model showing that for every 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase, we see about a 7% decline in September stream flow. So, we haven't really had great changes yet in air temperature, but obviously those are coming with climate change and will become an increasing factor. Basically, just the hotter it gets, the more water the vegetation is going to use. So, in conclusion, we do see that the summer and early fall flow is declining in many of our streams. There's a combination of reasons for that. One is, we're in a relatively drier cycle now than we were in the 50s and 60s when a lot of these gauges were installed. Diversions do appear to be increasing. However, at basin-wide scales, those don't appear to completely explain the changes that are going on. In fact, they explain only a smaller portion of that. But in those areas where there is a lot of diversions happening within a small area, that obviously has catastrophic effect for those smaller streams, and it contributes to the basin-wide patterns, but doesn't fully explain the basin-wide patterns. So it seems that there's an increase in the evapotranspiration from the forest and the vegetation in those watersheds, and that's due to, I think, a combination of conifer encroachment due to fire suppression, the structure and composition of our forests. We have a lot of dense young forests. I think we need to do more research to figure out to quantify these effects. Air temperature is increasing, which is also declining stream flow, and fog is going down as well. So, for example, in Bull Creek, that's kind of the inland extent of the fog, and so it may be that part of the declines in stream flow we're seeing at Bull Creek is because it's at the kind of the edge of the fog, whereas Little River on the north coast there, it's kind of a lot closer to the ocean, and so it may be less affected if kind of the inland extent of fog is declining. And then finally, the stream flow declines were less frequent in our most pristine watersheds, such as Elder Creek at the headwaters of the South Fork of the Eel, the Salmon River, and the Trinity River upstream of Trinity Lake. So with that, if we have time, I'll take questions or move on. I'm not sure. Okay, great.